Good evening, and welcome to Restored Lore, your home for old, odd, and obscure stories. Tonight's story is Little Chu by Songling Pu. The 17th century story comes from Strange Stories from a Chinese Studio, as translated and edited by Herbert Allen Giles in 1916. This story is a particularly vivid demonstration of the permeability of the boundary between life and death in Chinese folklore and mythology. Now, let's open our imaginations and begin. A man named Li Hua dwelt at Changshu. He was very well off and about 50 years of age, but he had no sons, only one daughter named Xiao Hui, a pretty child on whom her parents doted. When she was 14, she had a severe illness and died, leaving their home desolate and depriving them of their chief pleasure in life. Mr. Li then bought a concubine, and she by and by bore him a son who was perfectly idolized and called Chu, or the Pearl. This boy grew up to be a fine, manly fellow, although so extremely stupid that when 5 or 6 years old he didn't know pulse from corn and could hardly talk plainly. His father, however, loved him dearly and did not observe his faults. Now it chanced that a one-eyed priest came to collect alms in the town, and he seemed to know so much about everybody's private affairs that the people all looked upon him as superhuman. He himself declared he had control over life, death, happiness, and misfortune, and consequently no one dared refuse him whatever sum he chose to ask of them. From Li he demanded 100 ounces of silver, but was offered only 10, which he refused to receive. This sum was increased to 30 ounces, whereupon the priest looked sternly at Li and said, "I must have 100, not a fraction less." Li now got angry and went away without giving him any, the priest, too, rising up in a rage and shouting after him, "I hope you won't repent." Shortly after these events, Little Chu fell sick and crawled about the bed, scratching the mat, his face being of an ashen paleness. This frightened his father, who hurried off with 80 ounces of silver and begged the priest to accept them. "A large sum like this is no trifling matter to earn," said the priest, smiling. "But what can a poor recluse like myself do for you?" So Li went home to find that Little Chu was already dead, and this worked him into such a state that he immediately laid a complaint before the magistrate. The priest was accordingly summoned and interrogated, but the magistrate wouldn't accept his defense and ordered him to be bambooed. The blows sounded as if falling on leather, upon which the magistrate commanded his lictors to search him, and from about his person they drew forth 2 wooden men, a small coffin, and 5 small flags. The magistrate here flew into a passion and made certain mystic signs with his fingers, which when the priest saw, he was frightened and began to excuse himself, but the magistrate would not listen to him and had him bambooed to death. Li thanked him for his kindness and, taking his leave, proceeded home. In the evening, after dusk, he was sitting alone with his wife when suddenly in popped a little boy who said, "Pa, why did you hurry on so fast? I couldn't catch you up." Looking at him more closely, they saw that he was about 7 or 8 years old, and Mr. Li, in some alarm, was on the point of questioning him when he disappeared, reappearing again like smoke, and, curling round and round, got upon the bed. Li pushed him off, and he fell down without making any sound, crying out, "Pa, why do you do this?" And in a moment he was on the bed again. Li was frightened and ran away with his wife, the boy calling after them, "Pa! Ma! Boo!" They went into the next room, bolting the door after them, but there was the little boy at their heels again. Li asked him what he wanted, to which he replied, "I belong to So Chu. My name is Chan. At 6 years of age, I was left an orphan. My brother and his wife couldn't bear me, so they sent me to live at my maternal grandfather's. One day, when playing outside, a wicked priest killed me by his black art underneath a mulberry tree, and made of me an evil spirit, dooming me to everlasting devildom without hope of transmigration. Happily, you exposed him, and I would now remain with you as your son."
"The paths of men and devils," replied Li, "lie in different directions. How can we remain together?"
"Give me only a tiny room," cried the boy. "A bed, a mattress, and a cup of cold gruel every day. I ask for nothing more."
So Li agreed, to the great delight of the boy, who slept by himself in another part of the house, coming in the morning and walking in and out like any ordinary person. Hearing Li's concubine crying bitterly, he asked how long Little Chu had been dead, and she told him 7 days.
"It's cold weather now," said he, "and the body can't have decomposed. Have the grave opened and let me see it. If not too far gone, I can bring him to life again."
Li was only too pleased and went off with the boy, and when they opened the grave they found the body in perfect preservation. But while Li was controlling his emotions, lo, the boy had vanished from his sight. Wondering very much at this, he took Little Chu's body home and had hardly laid it on the bed when he noticed the eyes move. Little Chu then called for some broth, which put him into a perspiration, and then he got up. They were all overjoyed to see him come to life again, and, what is more, he was much brighter and cleverer than before. At night, however, he lay perfectly stiff and rigid without showing any signs of life, and, as he didn't move when they turned him over and over, they were much frightened and thought he had died again. But towards daybreak he awaked as if from a dream, and in reply to their questions said that when he was with the wicked priest there was another boy named Ko Tzu, and that the day before, when he had been unable to catch up to his father, it was because he had stayed behind to bid adieu to Ko Tzu, and that Ko Tzu was now the son of an official in purgatory named Chiang, and very comfortably settled, and that he had invited him, Chan, to go and play with him that evening, and had sent him back on a white-nosed horse. His mother then asked if he had seen Little Chu in purgatory, to which he replied,
"Little Chu has already been born again. He and our father here had not really the destiny of father and son. Little Chu was merely a man named Yen Su Fang from Qin who had come to reclaim an old debt."
Now, Mr. Li had formerly traded to Qin and had actually owed money for goods to a Mr. Yen, but he had died and no one else knew anything about it, so that he was now greatly alarmed when he heard this story. His mother next asked the quasi-Little Chu. Giles now says, it may be necessary here to remind the reader that Chan's spirit is speaking from Chu's body. If he had seen his sister, Xiao Hui, and he said that he had not, promising to go again and inquire about her. A few days afterwards he told his mother that Xiao Hui was very happy in purgatory, being married to a son of one of the judges, and that she had any quantity of jewels and crowds of attendants when she went abroad.
"Why doesn't she come home to see her parents?"
asked his mother.
"Well," replied the boy, "dead people, you know, haven't got any flesh or bones. However, if you can only remind them of something that happened in their past lives, their feelings are at once touched. So yesterday I managed, through Mr. Chiang, to get an interview with Xiao Hui, and we sat together on a coral couch, and I spoke to her of her father and mother at home, all of which she listened to as if she was asleep. I then remarked, 'Sister, when you were alive you were very fond of embroidering double-stemmed flowers, and once you cut your finger with the scissors and the blood ran over the silk, but you brought it into the picture as a crimson cloud. Your mother has that picture still, hanging at the head of her bed, a perpetual souvenir of you. Sister, have you forgotten this?' Then she burst into tears and promised to ask her husband to let her come and visit you."
His mother asked when she would arrive, but he said that he could not tell. However, one day he ran in and cried out, Mother, Xiao Hui has come with a splendid equipage and a train of servants. We had better get plenty of wine ready." In a few moments he came in again, saying, "Here is my sister," at the same time asking her to take a seat and rest. He then wept, but none of those present saw anything at all. By and by, he went out and burnt a quantity of paper money and made offerings of wine outside the door, returning shortly and saying he had sent away her attendants for a while. Also that Xiao Hui asked if the green coverlet, a small portion of which had been burnt by a candle, was still in existence. "It is," replied her mother, and, going to a box, she at once produced the coverlet. "Xiao Hui would like a bed made up for her in her old room," said her quasi-brother. "She wants to rest a while and will talk with you again in the morning." Now, their next-door neighbor, named Chao, had a daughter who was formerly a great friend of Xiao Hui's, and that night she dreamt that Xiao Hui appeared with a turban on her head and a red mantle over her shoulders, and that they talked and laughed together precisely as in days gone by. "I am now a spirit," said Xiao Hui, "and my father and mother can no more see me than if I was far separated from them. Dear sister, I would borrow your body from which to speak to them. You need fear nothing." On the morrow, when Miss Chao met her mother, she fell on the ground before her and remained some time in a state of unconsciousness, at length saying, "Madam, it is many years since we met. Your hair has become very white." "The girl's mad," said her mother in alarm, and, thinking something had gone wrong, proceeded to follow her out of the door. Miss Chao went straight to Li's house, and there with tears embraced Mrs. Li, who didn't know what to make of it at all. "Yesterday," said Miss Chao, "when I came back, I was unhappily unable to speak with you. Unfilial wretch that I was, to die before you and leave you to mourn my loss. How can I redeem such behavior?" Her mother thereupon began to understand the scene, and, weeping, said to her, "I have heard you hold an honorable position, and this is a great comfort to me. But, living as you do in the palace of a judge, how is it you are able to get away?" "My husband," replied she, "is very kind, and his parents treat me with all possible consideration. I experience no harsh treatment at their hands." Here Miss Chao rested her cheek upon her hand, exactly as Xiao Hui had been wont to do when she was alive. And at that moment in came her brother to say that her attendants were ready to return. "I must go," said she, rising up and weeping bitterly all the time, after which she fell down and remained some time unconscious as before. Shortly after these events, Mr. Li became dangerously ill, and no medicines were of any avail, so that his son feared they would not be able to save his life. 2 devils sat at the head of his bed, one holding an iron staff, the other a nettle hemp rope 4 or 5 feet in length. Day and night his son implored them to go, but they would not move, and Mrs. Li, in sorrow, began to prepare the funeral clothes. Towards evening her son entered and cried out, "Strangers and women, leave the room! My sister's husband is coming to see his father-in-law." He then clapped his hands and burst out laughing. "What is the matter?" asked his mother. "I am laughing," answered he, "because when the 2 devils heard my sister's husband was coming, they both ran under the bed like terrapins, drawing in their heads." By and by, looking at nothing, he began to talk about the weather and to ask his sister's husband how he did, and then he clapped his hands and said, "I begged the 2 devils to go, but they would not. It is all right now." After this, he went out to the door and returned, saying, "My sister's husband has gone. He took away the 2 devils tied to his horse. My father ought to get better now. Besides, Xiao Hui's husband said that he would speak to the judge and obtain 100 years' lease of life both for you and my father." The whole family rejoiced exceedingly at this, and when night came, Mr. Li was better, and in a few days quite well again. A tutor was engaged for the quasi-Little Chu, who showed himself an apt pupil, and at 18 years of age took his bachelor's degree. He could also see things of the other world, and when anyone in the village was ill, he pointed out where the devils were and burnt them out with fire so that everybody got well. However, before long, he himself became very ill, and his flesh turned green and purple, whereupon he said, "The devils afflict me thus because I let out their secrets. Henceforth I shall never divulge them again." This story just keeps introducing characters in order to kill them off. It's like Game of Thrones. Okay, so the original Little Chu wasn't really Little Chu. He was a man named Yen Su Fang who had been reborn as the son of Li in order to collect a debt. Which, by the way, how does that work? If he is reborn as somebody's son and he just lives at their expense for 18 or 20 years, is that how he's paid back? Anyway, then Little Chu died because the wizard or whatever was mad at his father for not paying him enough money. Then the family was haunted by an orphan named Chan, who moved into Chu's body when they dug him up. But somehow this Chan/Chu also knows everything about Chu's dead sister's childhood and the family, but then he also knows everything about everything, it seems. And later, when the sister returns from the dead to visit her family, she borrows the body of the girl next door. It's all so weird and confused about who is really alive and who is dead and who is in whose body. The story is also packed with fascinating details. The evil wizard priest was carrying 2 wooden men, a small coffin, and 5 small flags. The girl pricks her finger and bleeds onto the embroidery, but then she makes the bloodstain part of the design as some crimson clouds. Mr. Li is tormented to the point of death by devils sitting at the head of his bed, holding an iron staff and a nettle hemp rope 4 or 5 feet in length. And mind you, the story does not say that they use these things on him. They just sit at his bed and hold them. It's all so bizarrely specific. This story also reminds me of the Shui Meng plant, which I posted last October, where people are going into the afterlife and they're meeting people and they're doing deeds on behalf of the living, although that story was actually much less confusing than this one. According to the Wikipedia entry for Strange Stories from a Chinese Studio, these scary stories are not intended to be frightening, but to blur the borders between the supernatural and everyday reality, using physical and psychological detail to make the move between these realms seem natural. These tales explore the philosophical concept of Qing, the passionate and emotional entanglement of the world, be it human or supernatural. If that is true, this story might be the greatest embodiment of that exploration of any of the ones in Giles's collection. The 7 Confucian emotions of happiness, anger, grief, fear, love, hate, and desire are all explored in this little story, and most of them from both sides of the grave. If you listen all the way to the end of the video, you get to hear me make a little confession. Tonight's confession is that this story has been sitting in my scripts folder for a long time, but I've been trying to do longer stories, so I didn't plan on actually recording it in the near future. However, we've been doing a lot of stories from Northern Europe lately, and so I wanted to explore something different, but all of my good stories from China and Japan are pretty short. So I started reading stories from all over the place. I was southern India and Afghanistan and whatnot, but I couldn't find anything that I was really interested in that was the right length. So then I found this fascinating Zulu legend from Africa. Now, normally I read the entire story before I start formatting the document and making a script. All these old books on archive.org are OCR text and they're kind of a mess to read out loud, so I copy them over and clean them up and I make them easier to read as a part of my process. By then, I was behind for the week, so I started formatting my documents and everything before I was fully finished reading the story. And this particular story was especially hard to format because it was bilingual text in columns, and there were super extensive footnotes that spanned several pages, but it was a super interesting story. So I was working along for a couple of hours, and then 5 missing pages, just not scanned, just not there. The whole end of the story was gone. And I really actually did want to know what happened, but of course I couldn't read that to you. So then I was really behind for the week, and I found a bunch of old legends from Germany. And yes, I didn't want to be so much in Europe this week, but I was kind of out of time to be fussy. And it was a really interesting story about this girl who was kind of betrayed by a crazy mother and a warlord father. And when she was orphaned, she was taken in by an evil magician, and blah, blah, blah. She gets all these magical powers, and she goes off to live in this castle in the forest where she disguises herself as an old crone in order to give medicines and whatnot to the villagers. And this girl has everything. She has a castle, and she has a magical garden, and she has an alchemical laboratory. She has a star on her brow and a room with magic mirrors that show her the future. She's got a white dove that is kind of her familiar. She's got a waterfall cave where she learns from elemental spirits and all of this stuff. But of course, she's lonely. So one day, this peasant's son from the village comes climbing into her secret garden, and they see each other, and it's love at first sight, even though he shot her dove. So they fall in love, and she shows him all of her cool stuff, and he starts to feel a little bit intimidated, and so she feels bad, and she starts to lose her magical powers. And then everyone in the village thinks he's been enchanted and bewitched and wants him to start acting normal again. So he tells her that they can't be together unless she gives up all of her magic and becomes an ordinary person. And she does! And on the morning of their wedding, a wolf comes out of the forest and kills her. And I was so pissed off. It was like late last night, and I had to walk away and get a glass of wine. Here's yet another woman dimming her shine for some mediocre man. That book really is beautifully written, and I'm always kind of interested in those local legends, and they're hyper local. But both of the stories I've read from that book so far are really mean to the women. And I had spent hours and hours on this whole thing. So then I just went back into my list of stories that I've already read and liked, and I pulled up this one, even though, as I mentioned, it's shorter than I wanted. I wonder if I could just gather up a bunch of 2 short stories into a single video. Some Dunsany stories are really incredible, but they're just like 1 or 2 pages long, but maybe a sort of compilation format would work. Anyway, I do hope you've enjoyed this exploration of the Chinese afterlife, and if you like weird old stories and personal diatribes, you are in the right place. At Restored Lore, I find old, odd, and obscure stories, and I share them with you every week. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss anything. And drop me a like or a comment below, or use the link in the description or the QR code on screen to buy me a coffee to fuel my literary excursions. Thank you so much for your support, and I will see you in a few days.